All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack a truly fascinating area of the law, the legal concept of nuisance. I mean, if you've ever lived next to a noisy construction site, a blasting stereo, or just a neighbor whose habits completely turned your daily life upside down, you've probably wondered, hey, what are my rights here? Well, the law of nuisance is essentially the legal system's specific tool for dealing with difficult neighbors and complex property disputes. And today, we're going to break down exactly how this all works. You know that feeling, right? That universal frustration when you're just trying to relax on a weekend and someone is totally messing with your peace and quiet. But here's our very first lesson. The law actually requires a lot more than just mere annoyance for you to take legal action. Simply being annoyed? Yeah, that isn't enough to drag someone into court. We need to look at the actual specific legal definitions. So, to make this perfectly clear, we are going to act like first-year law students and systematically break this down. We'll cover Section 1, what is a nuisance? Section 2, public versus private nuisance. Section 3, the two key elements. Section 4, discomfort versus physical damage. Section 5, real-world court cases. And Section 6, the 5 deciding factors. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, what is a nuisance? Defining the annoyance. Let's start by defining our terms. Because while the word nuisance in everyday language literally just means an annoyance, the legal definition carries some serious weight. Historically, the famous legal scholar William Blackstone defined a nuisance pretty broadly. He said it's basically anything that causes hurt, inconvenience, or damage to another person. And honestly, while that's a great foundational concept, it's just a bit too broad for modern courts to actually use on a daily basis. So let's look at the modern legal view. The scholar Winfield narrows it down beautifully. He defines a legal nuisance specifically as an unlawful interference with a person's use or enjoyment of their land. Basically, it's an action that actively threatens health, safety, or comfort. The key takeaway here? It's not just about you feeling bothered. It's about a measurable, unlawful interference with your actual property rights. Moving right along to Section 2. Public versus private nuisance, society versus the individual. So a absolutely crucial point here is figuring out exactly who is being affected by this unlawful interference. The law splits nuisances into two distinct categories based on scale. On one side, we've got a public nuisance. This happens when an act affects a whole class of society. Think of a local quarry blasting rock, sending huge clouds of dust and heavy vibrations into an entire surrounding town. That's public. On the flip side is a private nuisance. This is a highly targeted interference with your specific right to enjoy your own individual home or land. It's essentially a one-on-one dispute between neighbors. All right, Section 3, the two key elements, what the law actually requires. If you actually want to prove a nuisance in court, you have to establish two mandatory legal elements. Miss even one of these and your case falls apart completely. Step 1, the interference you're complaining about cannot just be some minor, everyday inconvenience. It must be substantial. And Step 2, the interference must be unreasonable. Look, the court gets that we all have to live together in a crowded world, right? Some give and take is totally expected. The law only steps in when a neighbor's behavior clearly crosses the line into being both substantial and unreasonable. Let's look at Section 4, discomfort versus physical damage. How that substantial interference actually manifests. When we talk about that first element, a substantial interference, it usually shows up in one of two very distinct ways in the real world. The first category is an interference with your basic comfort and enjoyment of the land. Imagine losing an entire night's sleep because your neighbor is blasting music all night long. Now, it doesn't break your windows, but it completely destroys your ability to comfortably use your own bedroom. So we can directly compare these two categories. On the one hand, you have a feeling of discomfort and loss of enjoyment. This covers things like severe noise, terrible smells, things like that. But on the other hand, we have the second category, which is much more concrete, actual material or physical damage. This is when your neighbor's actions physically harm your property, like literally breaking a fence, ruining crops, or flooding your basement. Now for the fun part, Section 5, real-world court cases, when neighbors actually go to court. To really grasp how this works, let's look at how courts have historically handled two extreme real-world examples. Let's start with a case centered purely on extreme discomfort. Back in 1956, there was this case called Thompson-Schwab v. Kostaki. A homeowner living on a perfectly respectable residential street was dealing with an incredibly uncomfortable situation. The house right next door was being used for prostitution, with men constantly coming and going. The complaining neighbor, who we call the plaintiff in legal terms, decided to sue. And guess what? The court officially held that this specific activity caused such a substantial feeling of discomfort and so completely ruined the enjoyment of the property that it was an actionable private nuisance, meaning it was legally severe enough to win a lawsuit over. Even without any physical damage to the plaintiff's home, the sheer unreasonable nature of the activity in that specific neighborhood totally crossed the legal line. Now, let's flip over to the physical damage slide. Check out the case of Go Chat Nhi. In this one, the defendant, the person being sued, was doing some intense mining work on their land. Because of this, water escaped and literally flooded the neighboring plaintiff's land. The court found them strictly liable for this. That means they were legally responsible for the damage, period, whether it was an accident or not. Causing physical water damage to someone else's property, that is a textbook example of unreasonable and unlawful interference. Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, the 5 deciding factors, how courts decide. So, you might be wondering, how does a judge actually look at a messy neighborhood dispute and decide if something is legally unreasonable? Well, it's not a guessing game. The court weighs 5 highly specific factors. First, damage and locality, like where is this actually happening? Second, the benefits of the activity. Is that noisy factory providing a vital service to the town? Third, the sensitivity of the plaintiff. Are you just overly sensitive to totally normal noises? Fourth, duration. Was this a one-time thing or is it happening every single day? And fifth, malice. Is your neighbor doing this specifically and intentionally just to annoy you? Let's zoom in on that very first factor, locality, because this one is huge. If you actively choose to move into a heavy industrial zone, you simply cannot expect the fresh, quiet air of a mountain retreat. What's considered a total nuisance in a quiet suburb might be perfectly acceptable in a busy factory district. But and this is a massive exception. If the interference causes actual physical damage to your property, that locality factor becomes completely irrelevant. You can't legally damage someone's property no matter what zone you happen to be in. So, as we wrap up this explanator, I want you to apply this directly to your own life. Think about your own neighborhood for a second. Based on these strict legal definitions we just learned and those 5 balancing factors, does your most annoying neighbor actually owe you a day in court? Or does the law suggest you maybe just need to go buy some better earplugs? It's a super fine line between a daily annoyance and a true legal nuisance. But hey, now you know exactly where that line is drawn.